presentation is on the cardinal virtues. So last week we had a basic introduction into the virtues and then went into a little bit of a deeper dive on the theological virtues. And so now this week we go into the cardinal virtues, and this is set up so that we are going to kind of do a basic introduction to the cardinal virtues here, where we're going to review some of the concepts from last week's presentations. And then in the days to come, we will go through each of the cardinal virtues in a little more detail. So by way of review, our definition of virtue is a firm, habitual disposition to achieve our ultimate good, and our ultimate good in the theological context of God. What we mean by habitual and firm is that it's lasting, it's solid, it's stable. That ability to acquire a talent, a skill, or something, and it just kind of never goes away, like riding the bike. That's why we have that expression. It's like riding a bike, because even though you learn riding a bike as a child, and you may go years into adulthood not riding a bike, you can get on and it comes back to you almost instantly. It's natural, it's solid. It's a disposition. What we mean by that is that it is the power to do something. Not that you are always doing it. I mean, when you're sleeping, clearly you're not exercising a lot of virtue. But that doesn't mean that your ability to act virtuously goes away. All right, so it's a disposition. It's a kind of a readiness at all times to be able to do something. And finally, virtue is directed towards the good. If it were directed towards evil, it would be called vice. So all virtue is directed towards the good. If you think that you are exercising virtue and doing something evil at the same time, you are incorrect. It cannot be virtue. Virtue is always directed towards the good. There are 7 virtues of which the Catholic tradition recognizes. The 4 cardinal or moral virtues from classic antiquity: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, to which we add the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And the divisions, as I've kind of indicated in that grouping of 7, we have the 3 theological virtues and our subject matter for today, which is the 4 moral, human, or cardinal virtues. We have to understand that either of those names will work in reference to these virtues. And so the virtues we're discussing today are the 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and we will look into each of these virtues in detail in the days to come. So, as I indicated in last week's presentation, there are essentially, when we study theology and moral theology of the virtues, there are 2 types. So not only there are 2 types of virtues, the theological and the moral virtues, but within the moral virtues, the human virtues, the cardinal virtues, we have kind of 2 subtypes that should go together. We have the acquired moral virtue and the infused moral virtue. So let's talk about the acquired moral virtue first. So acquired moral virtue, I want to clue in on that word acquire. We can acquire them, first of all, through our own human action. When I perform any kind of act, I'm setting myself up for the future. What I mean by that is, if I commit one act, then in a sense I'm making myself not only capable of doing that in the future, but maybe even kind of influencing myself to do that in the future. Every act that we commit forms us, it shapes us. And it could be the planting the seed of a habit. Now, lots of studies have come out, about how long it takes to acquire a habit, whether it be 30 days or 90 days, or how often you have to do it. But it starts with that first act, that one act. And so virtue, in a sense, is doing just that. It's acquired moral virtue is done through human action, meaning I perform the action. Right? It's my work, I do the work. But moreover, it's repeated. Right? Once you repeat an action over and over and over, then it starts to become ingrained. It becomes easier and easier and easier for us to commit those actions. And so we can kind of see, in a sense, if it were good actions, if it was difficult for me to give money to that poor man at the stop sign the first time, but then once I did it that one time, it becomes a little bit easier, a little bit easier. With each time, it becomes even easier. And the next thing you know, it's nothing for me to shell out a few bucks to the guy asking for money, who is poverty stricken. And so the repeated action starts to instill within us this openness. But the key is acquired in varying circumstances. Right? What I mean by that is it's not just giving out money to the guy at the stop sign. It's also being generous at church when there's a donation for the poor, the homeless. It's also finding other ways that my money can go to help out the poor and impoverished in society. Brushing my teeth every morning in the same circumstances over and over, that's a habit. That's not a virtue. But through my own action, through repeated action in different circumstances, that's virtue because it opens myself up to be virtuous in all circumstances. Back to that example of giving money to the poor, you're not necessarily virtuously generous, and that is one of the daughter virtues. You're not necessarily generous simply because you shell out a few bucks every time you see a homeless person at a stop sign or a stoplight, but don't give any money to anything else or support any other causes outside of that. That's just a habit, like brushing your teeth, right? Don't think that you are virtuous because you brush your teeth every morning and every evening, right? Monkeys can do that, right? It's really not that difficult because it's an ingrained habit that you don't think about. What makes virtue is being able to sense in a particular situation or circumstance that here is an opportunity for me to be generous. No matter how different all the circumstances look, I have the opportunity to be generous here, and I choose it. But I choose it now because I've practiced, I've had that repeated action in all different kinds of circumstances. So acquired moral virtue is the virtue by which we seek our natural good, right? Our natural good being our natural purpose, our natural goal, by good means, meaning our actions. Not only do we have to seek good things, our good ends or goals or purposes, we also have to seek the good ways of accomplishing those things. And we do this through right reason, right? Living reasonably. And when we get to the infused moral virtue in the next slide, I'll use an example that kind of explains a little bit about the interplay between these two. So let's go ahead and look at the infused moral virtue. Infused moral virtue is received, not acquired, okay? I can acquire moral virtue by going out and doing something. I don't acquire infused moral virtue. I receive it specifically through baptism and sanctifying grace. Okay, so infused moral virtue is received via baptism with sanctifying grace. The infused moral virtues, they're no different. The acquired moral virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. The infused moral virtues are also prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. And that's because these virtues, they flow out of the theological virtue of charity, love. Now, because they flow out of the virtue of charity, they can be lost with mortal sin, because remember, mortal sin means the casting out of sanctifying grace and the loss of charity. All right, so if the infused moral virtues come with charity, then they go with charity. So we receive them in the grace of baptism. We also restore them in the grace of confession. But if we sin mortally, we cast charity out of our souls because we love something else above God. And so the infused moral virtues are lost. And then the infused moral virtues are essentially the basis for living the supernatural life worthy of heaven, right? And what we mean by that, that is this. Let me give you this example. So let's take the example of the virtue of temperance. Temperance is the virtue of being able to say yes when we should say yes, or say no when we should say no. It's to live temperately. It's to to find that nice, happy medium between indulgence and overindulgence and underindulgence, so to speak. And so um, temperance keeps that just medium. Let's take the matter of food. So temperance takes a just medium in the matter of food in order that we may live reasonably, meaning we don't want to eat too much to injure our health, but we also don't want to eat too little, which also can injure our health. And in doing so, we exercise good reason. This is how much I need. And sometimes some of us struggle with not eating enough for the wrong reasons. Some of us struggle with eating way too much. Our minds tell us that we're still hungry, but we're not. We're not really hungry. We just want to eat more food. We have this kind of mental, emotional desire, but not actually a physical desire. And it's our reason that comes in and can override that and say, no, you don't need to eat any more food because you're not really hungry. You don't really need that food. That's acquired moral virtue, right? Infused moral virtue is a little bit different. Infused temperance keeps a superior, happy medium in the use of food, not so that we may live reasonably, but so that we may live for God. Through infused temperance, we understand that food sustains my body, which is subservient to my soul, and my soul seeks God as my ultimate good. And so then I live not just reasonably, but I live supernaturally. I eat the right amount of food for love of God. Now, infused temperance, by which I love God, I can also fly in the face of acquired temperance by saying, no, I'm not going to eat all day today. Well, that's not a good choice. Actually, fasting for love of God. I'm going to deny myself this food that I need to remind myself that my body is subservient and subordinate to my soul who seeks God alone. And remember, it's Jesus Christ who said, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. See, through infused moral virtue, the acquired moral virtues are raised to a supernatural level. And so, by infused moral virtue, we seek our supernatural good, that is God, by good means, the normal actions seemingly that would be done through acquired moral virtue, but out of love for God. And it's done through perfected reason, that is, reason that's perfected by the light of faith. So, with this introduction that we've gone through, we're going to then, in the presentations to come, look at prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance.